Welcome to Pilgrim Lost. Come walk with us while we explore life in hopeful motion. It's Pilgrim Lost. Another exciting episode. I'm thrilled to be here. I spent my weekend actually daydreaming about trekking a little more than I should have when I should have been getting things done. It's one of those times where, well, part of the reason, honestly, was because of our guest this week. If I'm telling the truth, I was off watching Jeremiah Gibbs videos about Camino and trekking and some of that world, and I can't stop thinking about it. I'm really frustrated right now. I know I'm going to bring you on in a minute, Jeremiah. I'm just going to talk for a second, but I'm working too much these days, and it's kept me from my normal sort of lifestyle of trekking. And so I'm finding myself really missing the open road, even just, the daily 5 mile around the city. I'm really missing it. So anyway, today it's a new friend. This is a new friend, Dr. Jeremiah Gibbs, and you're at the University of Indianapolis, correct? You're the chaplain there?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm the university chaplain at the University of Indianapolis, my 13th year serving this role. So, yeah.
And you're married to a wonderful lady who's also in the world of helping form people spiritually, and you've got an adopted son.
Yeah.
And in addition to all those things, part of your job and then part of your life, your vocation beyond your job, is sort of a love of the Camino de Santiago and trekking. And we're going to talk about that some today.
Yeah.
So what did I miss? What would you like people to know about you that I didn't say?
Well, I mean, obviously, the reason that I got to meet you is because of the videos. So that's certainly one place that, Camino, my love for Camino has led me into this whole YouTube world, which is also just fun because YouTube is an interesting kind of platform to learn and to try to master. But yeah, so I have a lot of videos that I make for folks, mostly really helping them make the pilgrimage, although certainly plenty of it is talk about spirituality and really just telling my own kind of vlogging stories too of walking. Yeah, so that's a big part of how Camino for me, one of the reasons I started making the videos was because I couldn't be on Camino all the time. You're talking about like just missing the trekking and missing the community and those kind of things. Well, the videos allow me to be a pilgrim, 365 days a year. So yeah, it's become a big part of my life this year.
Well, the mission statement, the purpose statement of Pilgrim Lost is that it's inspired by these large treks like the Camino de Santiago, but focused on the everyday. How do we bring these themes into the everyday where they're not predicated on privilege? They're not predicated on, getting a month, 6 weeks off of work and spending thousands of dollars and having the sort of relational equity that you're like released to go do these sorts of things. That those forms of privilege are not necessary to experience these universally transformative things. I mean, every person I've ever talked to who has done long trekking, particularly the Camino de Santiago, they come back and they say it was a life-changing experience. And I refuse to believe that life change is predicated upon privilege. Life change should be accessible to all of us. It should be accessible in the everyday. It should even be accessible in the mundane. It should be accessible when you have small children screaming and tugging on your shirt tails. It should be accessible when you're working 40, 50, 60 hours a week in little ways. And how do we find those little ways in everyday life? And we're going to get into that at the end.
Yeah.
I also want to get into with you. You take a lot of people, a lot of neophytes, a lot of rookies. You've got a trip coming up in May with 30 first timers.
Yeah, 31. So there's 31 of us going. Only one of the other pilgrims has been before. So one of them has co-led a trip with me in the past. But the other 29 of them will be first time Camino walkers. And I would say of that group, only one or two have backpacking experience either.
Okay. So I want to get into that.
Yeah.
Before we go there, how many of those have you done? How many group where you've helped lead a group of people?
So group trips, this will be my fourth.
Fourth.
Yeah.
And then you personally, most of those are 10 to 15 day treks.
Yep.
Like,
yeah, usually I kind of target about 2 weeks of walking. Sometimes the trip will be a little longer as we might do some sightseeing and things, but usually about 2 weeks of actual walking days. Astorga on Camino Frances, or sometimes Ponferrada on Camino Frances. And then a little bit of, like I said, a little sightseeing too.
and what's the distance on that? What's the total distance?
Astorga is 165 miles, like 270 kilometers, something like that.
Okay.
I think Ponferrada might be 135 miles.
Have you done it just alone, or just just for yourself, as opposed to leading a group? Have you done that?
So I've never walked from St. John to Santiago by myself. I actually have walked all of the sections, but I've not done it in one swoop like that. But I have been on 3 occasions. I have been on sections of Camino by myself or with Jen. So I have done a little bit of the solo walking, and certainly I would say one of the most meaningful Caminos I've been on was the 12 or so days I spent on Camino back in July of this year, where I was by myself and got to be more like a solo pilgrim.
Nice. Now I know you've done some walking on the Appalachian Trail. True.
Yeah. So I last year did my first section of Appalachian Trail in Virginia, and I had a group of 5. I'd never done that trail before, and so I did have a few friends that went with me. And then this year I'll be going back in June for the next section north of where I was before in Virginia, but this time taking 11 people with me. And of that group, only about 4 have ever backpacked before. A lot of them, I shouldn't say have ever done backpacking with a tent. A lot of them are my former pilgrims, Camino pilgrims, that are now going to experience the Appalachian Trail. And then some of them have never been on any backpacking at all. So
from my perspective, over my 50 plus years on this blue and green orb, the Appalachian Trail is probably the most famous trail in North America that I'm aware of personally. Sure. We have a very similar trail, the Pacific Coast Trail, the PCT, here on the West Coast. Yeah. That a lot of people walk in chunks. It goes all the way from Mexico to Canada. Very robust. I've not spent hardly any time on it myself. Yeah. Our producer Mark, I think, has walked it a little bit. But give me 2 minutes on the Appalachian Trail, because I've never walked it, never been there. I just know the name, and it sounds East Coasty.
Yeah, it is. Well, first of all, I'm not sure what the elevation is like on PCT or Continental Divide, but the Appalachian Trail is all mountains. I mean, it is very, very mountainous. I'm actually in one of the flatter sections in the part that I'm doing in Virginia. But still, the comparison between that and Camino Frances, for example, is, night and day. It's very, very steep. I would say that on the whole, Appalachian Trail is very much wilderness. You do come in and out of some towns where you can do some resupply every week or so. One of the things that makes Appalachian Trail easier than, for example, Pacific Coast or CDT is the water supplies are very plentiful on the Appalachian Trail. So, for example, you pass by a stream about 2 to 3 times a day in many sections, which means that it's much less risky, right? So when you don't have water for sometimes several days at a time, that's when people who don't have a lot of experience backpacking can get themselves in trouble. So in that sense, Appalachian Trail is safer for new backpackers, I think, than some other of our distance trails. But it's still very, very strenuous. And there's a section in the northern part of Appalachian Trail I've not been through called the 100-Mile Wilderness, where there's no food supplies, no people, anything for 100 miles of very challenging terrain. So So there are sections of it that are quite difficult. But I think one of the things that I think is an interesting dynamic about this, it's very similar. So I think one of the things that's really interesting about Appalachian Trail, and one of the things that makes it powerful in some of the same ways that Camino de Santiago is that so many people enter into Appalachian Trail without a lot of experience, and they go on very long sections, maybe the whole thing, maybe just very long sections. But, you know, these are people who know when they, well, at least they don't know when they start, whether they can finish. You know, I just had a long conversation with pilgrims that I'm collaborating with and making videos yesterday. And we were talking about how our fears when we began Camino was being unsure of whether we could do it. And that experience, I think, is even more powerful for folks who are walking the AT for the first time. And that place of fear, that uncertainty, and learning to trust yourself, learning to trust the people around you, learning to trust the fact that thousands of people are walking this every day, so probably I can do it too. And just kind of moving into that is really powerful and life-changing for a lot of people on the AT. And I think one of the things that when I met people, I had Camino, patches on my pack, and I have a Camino tattoo. And so when I was on the AT, I met a lot of pilgrims, and many of them would say things like, "This is just the same for me as when I walked Camino de Santiago." Now, that is not true for me. I do not like walking the AT as much as I love the Camino. I don't enjoy it as much, and I don't find it as spiritually encouraging. But many of the people had some of the same kinds of language that folks have when they talk about Camino, that were distance hiking. And I should say, when I walked last year, we intentionally put ourselves right in the middle of the through hikers for that year. We went at a time and in a place where we knew that there would be lots and lots of through hikers. So I got to meet a lot of them.
Let's go back to in the middle of that, you said, that there's this fear I'm not going to be able to finish, or there's this fear going in. And I agree with you, particularly your first time. So much of sort of taking on your first big trek adventure, wherever it happens to be, is sort of administrating your fears and finding the energy, the belief, the faith, the hope that though I can't see the answer will sort of appear to me, whether that answer is I can do it, or the answer is my body's stronger than I thought it was, or the answer is I can bear being old, whatever. But what are the fears, with all these newbies that you take and you care for in both their preparation up to and then their early days walking? What are the fears that you really experience, you think a lot of people experience going on these long distance adventure hikes?
Well, certainly the whether I can do it fear is absolutely, I think, I would say more than 3/4 of the people that I lead, that is a dominant question for them when they begin. And the irony of that is, as somebody who now has led more than 100 pilgrims on Camino, I tell them, I've had 100 pilgrims on Camino. None of them have been in taxis for more than 10 miles, right? Like, everybody finishes, and now that's not totally true, right? We know that sometimes people can't finish, but in my case, everyone has finished. Right. And so to be able to say to somebody that you can do this, and yet they still have all the anxiety, maybe I'll be the one that can't, and so I think that physical fear absolutely is there. There's also, for many of my pilgrims, because I take a lot of 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds, and some of them, it's the first time they've ever traveled without their parents, and so that kind of anxiety about that dynamic is really, it's a big deal for them too. And it's a big deal for their parents to trust me to go, take their kid across the other side of the world. One of the things that I still have as an anxiety as a trip leader is whether the relationships are going to work. because group dynamics are tricky sometimes. And sometimes I don't know, are these people going to really connect with each other, or they're going to be big turmoil kind of brewing in the midst of that. And so that's a concern, which I think is in a parallel concern. Many people wonder whether they're going to be completely alone, whether they're going to connect with anybody and make any friends. Because I think for some people, Camino is a very solitary experience. For others, and this would be me, it's very much a communal experience, and that the relationships that are built there are part of why I go.
Yeah, I think people are afraid of the deprivation,
Yeah.
to walking away from all the stimulus we're used to having, having food at arm's length, having entertainment at arm's length, and then suddenly I'm going to walk for 5-6 hours a day, and what's going to fill my mind? And am I afraid? Am I afraid of that stillness? Am I afraid of does my mind have enough to sort of feed on during those long hours? And it helps with the group, and you've got people to talk to. I walked the Camino from Saint Jean alone, and I mean, even as a 51-year-old I did it when I was 48, but with some training in these things, I was scared to death that there wasn't enough in my mind to sustain the time.
Yeah.
So,
are you naturally, Tony, are you introverted, or are you more extroverted in your energy?
if you had asked me that for 90% of my life, I would have said absolutely an extrovert, high energy, really theatrical, shoving myself into the center of the party. But I am discovering that some of that what is roles that I play, and that in reality now I have to be alone. That's where I actually replenish. So
yeah. There's an interesting dynamic. I think that introverted extroverted dynamic is really, really it's so obvious when we're on Camino. But I also, the language that I use, and actually when I'm teaching spiritual formation, as well as when I'm talking with my pilgrims, is even though maybe the best thing that we can do formatively for us is to feed on and embrace the parts of our self that are most natural, that are most life-giving for us. So for me, as an extreme extrovert, I love staying up late at night, drinking and hanging out with the other pilgrims and trying to learn new words in Italian and all this other stuff. Like that for me is life-giving. But there's also, for all of us, you need to eat your vegetables too, right? Like whatever the thing that is not natural for you, go and let that be a part of your formation as well. Let that be part of the challenge for you. If you are an extrovert, to go and walk for hours by yourself, not talking with others, and vice versa. Somebody who's really introverted, go out and have meals with folks and let them see what it's like to form these new relationships in a new place and so on. So both have to, but I think both are important.
I also would argue, and maybe you want to either disagree with me or you can give me your thoughts on this, that we particularly privileged Americans, I'll just say Americans, that's my culture. I don't want to speak to other countries. Privileged Americans, that we have we've been trained to avoid adversity at all costs. That adversity has no value. And one of the great things about trekking is it does push you beyond what you think you're able. You do have to endure pain. Your body will experience tension, resistance along the way that you have to put every day. For me, at the 10-mile mark, I experience a resistance moment where my body wants to stop. And I averaged 22 miles a day when I walked it. So there's a lot more walking that day, but that 10-mile mark every day was I'm not going to be able to do this today. Today's going to be a short day. There's no way I'm going to pull it off. And then by the 12-mile mark, something else happened. But pushing through that envelope was an important spiritual, formative, whatever you want to say, psychological experience for me that I look back as a gift now.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the moment, it didn't feel like a gift.
Yeah.
But now, do you have any thoughts on that? Just the importance
Well,
of.
I would say, I mean, mine is a bit different. For me, mostly it comes in the morning because, I mean, the actual first steps, because I almost always am blistered terribly across my feet, like every hike. And
Mm,
so getting moving when you have blisters, like is hard. That first for 20 or 30 minutes until the blisters they become numb or something. I'm not sure what happens, but it takes about 20 minutes for you to be able to walk on these sore blisters.
mm,
And so,
mhm.
I mean, I'm just like limping along every single day to start the day off. And it's like, I don't, I mean, I tell people all the time, I actually don't like walking like this. I mean, I guess I do because I keep going back,
Right.
but the actual walking, I mean, I'm like, rah, 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 I'm grouchy about it and everything else. Um, because for me, it often means that I'm walking through these blisters and sometimes other sorenesses and so on, just like anybody else. But
Right, right. Whatever the resistance is, whatever the
yeah.
difficulty is, I just love as a professor of human and spiritual formation, like,
Mhm.
do you see value in that? That actually this life
Yeah.
of pleasure is not super helpful to forming us as
Yeah.
human beings,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think even if you look back to traditions of monastic communities, for example,
right?
where, there were plenty of monastic communities that would intentionally create pain for themselves, um, because it would allow them to get into a new place in their spiritual growth and challenge. I mean, obviously, many religious traditions have fasting as a part of their tradition. And why do you fast? Well, often it's to create that sense of discomfort, right? And that sense of discomfort then becomes this transitional place where you can grow and you can become something different as you push through the challenge. So I
Right.
personally would say absolutely yes. I think that it may not always be healthy for us to take up philosophies or practices that encourage that suffering or discomfort all the time. I think periods of discomfort are much more valuable. And this is really when we look at how people work out, right? You think about physical training. Um, your body needs the rest from the stress too, right? So you work out, you lift weights, and then you give yourself a day of resting from the weights because that's when the body actually restores and heals and builds up. And so I think that periods of discomfort, and for me, Camino and trekking as part of that,
Right.
is creating that period of discomfort so that there's a kind of rejuvenation afterwards. And there's parts of it that are certainly enjoyable, of course, or we wouldn't keep going back. But yeah, I think the kind of moving in and out of discomfort is a pretty valuable thing. Because if we look at the other side, you used the word privilege a few times. If we look at what it means to live a life without privilege, then we can see what it's like to suffer all the time, and that's not good for us, for our souls either, right? So I think that the ability to move in and out of these kind of periods of suffering and pleasure are really important.
Yeah, so I think it's important to make a distinction between self-abuse
Yeah.
and um, inviting tension, inviting these moments. And it is interesting. We had a couple of episodes ago, we had a Cherokee scholar on, Dr. Randy Woodley was on as a guest, and I really pressed him on the word pilgrim
Mm.
because when we named this Pilgrim Lost, the big argument to not name it that was that pilgrim is a mixed term. It has a mixed meaning in different communities, and we didn't want to do anything that would be harmful.
Yeah.
And and Dr. Woodley was very, very gracious. I mean, he acknowledged the American story and that the Pilgrim story is not in all ways the most positive story, particularly for Indigenous people of North America. But then he also said, but we have to also acknowledge that the word is larger than that. And there has been this universal human experience of going on pilgrimage.
Yeah.
And all these different cultures and all these different traditions, religious traditions and cultural traditions, have discovered it.
Yeah.
as an inherently valuable thing to helping us become more whole, helping us find our true self,
Mhm.
helping us find our place in the community, helping us adult and enter into like this next phase of life, whatever it is. It plays this role, wherever you're pilgriming to. And
Yeah.
Camino de Santiago just happens to be one that's been around for a long time and
Yeah.
historically has meant a lot to an awful lot of people.
Yep.
But I think it is important to have a distinction. And I would be curious from you,
Yeah.
where have you found the discomfort that led to healing, or where have you
Mm.
found pain that helped sort of rejuvenate, restore, or even rebirth something in you?
Mm. You know, I will say, on the whole, I have very much lived a life of privilege. And here there's financial privilege and so on that has come as well. Although I didn't grow up with a lot of wealth, lower middle class American to begin, and probably an upper middle class American now socially, but I have, I've had a good life in so many ways, and I don't know that I have had. I don't know that I felt a need for healing most of my life. I think there has been times of restoration for sure, but I don't experience life as someone who carries deep wounds or something like that. I mean, still discomfort is off. I mean, going all the way back to being in the Marine Corps, and going through Marine Corps boot camp and experiencing what that was like. And so these experiences of a kind of physical, I mean, suffering is discomfort is a better word, as you've been using. So I've had a lot of experiences, especially of physical discomforts and insecurities, maybe with regard to, exercises that were life threatening and things like that. But I just haven't. I'm very fortunate that most of my life has been one of great relationships and great people around me, and haven't needed the kind of healing and restoration in my life that I see in so many of the people that I counsel. For example, I mean, um, spend most of my days talking with people who are working through some pretty significant traumas, in my work at the university. And so I'm very aware of how much privilege has been in my life because of that.
Well, I appreciate and affirm that energy of gratitude,
Yeah.
and that to have a life that's been free of the shackles of this world that so many people
Yeah.
experience is laudable. At the same time, there's nothing new under the sun,
Mm.
as the teacher says, and there's a very real way that uh, that privilege also allows us to ignore um, our own holes and lack, the ways, because the ease and pleasure and constantly having our desires fulfilled, there's a way that also is numbing and can sometimes distract us. Speaking autobiographically, I mean that's what I've experienced.
Yeah.
There's as a guy who was raised middle class and
Yeah.
always went to great schools and all those sorts of things. There's there's a lot of shared life still, and I think part of the beauty of trekking is it allows us to deprogram. It allows us to break those habits, those rhythms that have sort of kept us numb, have kept us in the matrix, to
Yeah.
use a, a cinema term, have
Yeah.
kept us in the matrix, as opposed to realizing that this that steak for dinner every night isn't necessarily real.
All right.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think I, this is maybe not the exact same kind of direction you're talking about, but I think there's a parallel in the ways that Camino strips all of those factor. Not all of them. I still have credit cards in my pocket when I walk Camino, right? So I can buy my way out of rough situations and things like that.
Right. True.
That in the Way movie when when the
The Irish
character
writer.
gets drunk,
Yeah.
and like there's a way in which I recognize that I don't have to walk. If I wanted to get into a taxi and go to the nice hotel, I could.
Right.
But I do think that if you're going to try to stick to the pilgrimage way of Camino, it does strip a lot of our title and social standing and so many of those things, because at the end of the day, we're all just out there carrying a backpack and trying to find our next next bar that we can get a sandwich. And so I really appreciate the way that resets who I am in relationship to the people around me. When I'm on Camino, I was going to say when I'm on Camino, I'm not in charge of anything like I am in so many other places in my life. I guess I sort of am, because when I'm leading groups, I still have all these people that I'm responsible for getting there. But even there, it doesn't feel like it in the same way. I have to make sure that they have their needs met and that they're safe, but I'm not making strategic decisions that cost a lot of money for my institution or something like that, and so for me, one of the reasons I love Camino is that reset of I'm not, we're all in the same place in a lot of ways, and can disconnect from just our own privilege and our own power and all those things that are our day-to-day life as a person who's living in privilege. So.
And one of the great things about sort of long distance, extended meditation, I'll call it extended meditation, if your legs are moving or not, but the experience of extended meditation, the stilling of the mind, quieting the mind, the allowing of the traditional scripts and voices that fill our head every day, letting those voices start to ease and go, and inviting the new thoughts that maybe there wasn't space for before. There really is the opportunity to ask the question, what have I not processed about my life? Or what are the questions, even to call out to the divine or the creator or the universe or whatever it is for you, like what am I lacking? What do I need? What has my soul been lacking? What's the question I need to process? And I hadn't intended to get into this at all, but I have several African American uncles who are very, 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 very dear to me and very, very straightforward about culture. And when we get into discussing privilege, particularly white privilege, they are very quick to say, whenever the conversation turns to, gee golly, that African American experience, it sure sounds terrible, whatever. They're very quick to go, you have no idea. White privilege has damaged you far more than it's damaged us. It has damaged you, and you don't even understand the trauma. And that's one aspect of privilege that I want to go, well, that's protected me from trial. It's protected me from difficulty. And these beautiful older African American men who love me deeply and consider me their nephew, they're like, you are deeply damaged by this. You don't even understand how.
Well, and then, in the Christian tradition, one of the things that we frequently talk about, the fact that sin and this damage that we do to one another, this ways that we hurt one another, break our relationship with one another, it does hurt the other person when I sin against them. But actually, it destroys my own humanity when I sin against someone, right? Like I'm less human when I've sinned against someone. And I think that's really kind of what they're getting at, is like, actually when, and not that living in privilege itself is not a sin, but it does dehumanize us in a way, to be in that kind of unnatural state towards another.
Let's talk about this subhuman state, because I really do think there's something to it. I think there's so much of our life we really are living a subhuman existence. We are missing the beauty all around us. We are missing the glory in a stranger. We are missing the fullness of life inside, the knowledge of self, the true knowledge of who we are, how we're participating in the great story, all these sorts of things. Um, tell Give me some thoughts. I mean, you're a
Yeah.
teacher, you're a professor about this
Yeah.
stuff. How do we bring Camino home? How do we live it every day? How do we bring these themes, these transformative themes, into the mundane?
Yeah. Well, one place that I would start would be relationships, and I think this is a place where we can learn some lessons from the way that are very concrete when we want to bring those home. So one of the dynamics that I try to explain to people who are learning about Camino um, is I usually tell a story about how you will arrive at a bar at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You will sit down at a table with somebody you've never seen before. You'll just sit at their table. Within about 5 minutes, you'll be taking your shoes off to show them your blisters and at the table.
Sure.
And within about 10 minutes, you'll be talking about the philosophy of life and what kind of suffering has brought you to the way. And so there's a way in which the pilgrimage, and I think part of it is because of the unique community that we assume some things about other pilgrims. And because we assume some things about the degree of safety we have with them, their some shared values, et cetera, we open up so much more quickly and let those walls down that we put between us to keep us safe, right? Most of our walls that in our relationships, we perceive them to provide a level of safety from vulnerability. And I think that vulnerability is so natural on the way that people just automatically open up. I remember there was a particular pilgrim, and I was sitting on the train with this pilgrim on the way to our starting point. And I asked her, she was talking about an experience of anxiety and how she had suffered from anxiety for much of her life. And I asked her, I said, do you believe that if you were in a complete safe community, like everybody around you, you trusted them, you knew who they were, do you think you would still experience anxiety with them? Because some people with anxiety, they don't experience it when they're with really safe communities. And some people, it's just with them all the time. And the student responded, oh no, anxiety is part of who I am. It's just who I am. About 10 days later, through tears, she was telling the group, I've never experienced a time in my life when I didn't have anxiety. And I'm now a week into having not one bit of anxiety in any conversation along the way. And it was very moving for her because she'd never experienced relationships like that. I think that if we can find places of trust in relationships, the kind of trust that we automatically give to other pilgrims, not because they've earned it, but because we assume some things about them, then I think that that those relationships can be much more vulnerable and transformative in our lives. But we do have to figure out, how can I be vulnerable in that way? So that would be one that I think is, life lesson that we can bring home pretty quickly from Camino, is the way that those relationships form. I think the other thing that for me has been transformed, this may be the way that Camino has been most significant in my own spiritual growth as a person of faith and praise and so on, is I have learned how to make meditation and prayer a part of other activities. And in the monastic tradition, they do this all the time, right? So if you've learned about monastic communities, they often are making cheese or chocolate or baskets or pottery. They have these tasks, this work that they
Fear.
do. Beer, absolutely, yes. Wine. But they do these tasks that are repetitive and not particularly intellectual tasks, right? They're not something that require a lot of calculations. They're not building houses, right? They are making cheese. And so when they do that, they do those kinds of repetitive work because it's a way in which they can engage in prayer. And one of the things I've learned about the Camino de Santiago, or learned from it, is how to make mundane tasks meditative and prayerful. So my drives have become more prayerful. It's still kind of hard to drive and pray because you got to make sure you don't hit anybody. But I've learned how to make walking meditation, how to meditate as I run. I've just recently become a runner in the last year. And that has been incredibly valuable to my own life because we're doing these things all the time, right? Like if I can teach my students how to meditate for 7 to 8 minutes as they walk across this campus in between each classes, that means I've put an hour of meditation in their life every day, right? Because that's about how long they're going to take walking between classes every day. And I can insert an hour of meditation if they can learn to do it in 6 and 7 and 8 minute blocks as they walk across campus. And so that can be really transformative in our life, a way that we can center ourselves over and over again all day long.
Right on. I think we're kind of moving towards the end. This has been great. Is there anything, Jeremiah, you haven't had a chance to say that you'd like to say? Anything about being a pilgrim, experiencing that side of life? Anything out of this discussion that you want to circle back to?
Yeah, I think what I would say, and this is an ongoing theme on my YouTube channel, is I think a lot of folks, and I recognize this is talk about conversations of privilege. The fact that people often don't go because of the things I'm about to talk about is absolutely about privilege. But I think so many people get caught up and nervous about making the way because they feel they're nervous about traveling alone. They're nervous about whether they can make it, whether they can walk that far, nervous about whether they have, as you said, whether they have enough in their head to be able to sustain that kind of a journey. And I'm convinced that there are very few people who can't do this, very few people who won't benefit from it in a significant way. I usually say if you can walk 1 mile, you can probably walk 10 miles. And if you can walk 10 miles, you can probably walk Camino. Because, we're not talking about rocket science here. We're talking about one step in front of the other. And so I think if folks will just get over the anxiety of all of the fears that we carry and just begin walking, then they'll find a place that ends up being life transformative for them.
That's great. That's great. And whether that's in Spain or whether that's somewhere close to home, like trusting your body and giving it a chance. And I hated walking. I hated hiking. I live in Portland, Oregon, close to some of the most beautiful hiking in the entire world. And I grew up not liking it. And now I can't wait to walk all the time. I didn't even know I had that gear. And suddenly I realized I had it. Jeremiah Gibbs, jeremiahgibbs.com. There's a lot of Camino resources on the website. If you want, thoughts on budgeting for going on Camino de Santiago, you want thoughts on packing and sort of there's a lot of nuts and bolts, a lot of sort of the X's and O's of the how-tos of both prep and being there, as well as his own just sort of thoughts on living an inspired life, which is great.
Yeah, I should say, Tony, so jeremiahgibbs.com is a lot of my spirituality teachings and things like that. And some of my Camino, I've actually just put a new website up, caminoguide.info. And on caminoguide.info, I have a lot more of the Camino resources better sorted out.
Great.
I would encourage people to check that out and check out the YouTube at the Camino Guide too.
Thanks so much. Everybody, thanks for being here. Again, go check out Dr. Jeremiah Gibbs on both YouTube, his website, and CaminoGuide.info. And this is Pilgrim Lost, and I want to thank everyone for getting lost with us.